the heart of the bustling city, amidst the noise of honking cars and the constant rush of people, the Adiola family lived in a grand house, one that gleamed with wealth and prosperity. Their home was large, elegant, and filled with the finest furniture, the latest gadgets, and walls adorned with paintings that spoke of status and affluence. The finest marble floors gleamed under the chandelier lights, and every room was meticulously decorated to perfection. But for all the luxury that surrounded them, the house was hollow. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the hum of the air conditioners and the occasional ringing of a phone. In the kitchen, the smell of freshly made meals lingered, but the family rarely sat down together to share a meal. In the living room, an expensive television stood in the corner, but no one ever watched it together. The father, Mr. Adiola, was a successful businessman who ran several chain stores across the city. His days were packed with meetings, negotiations, and endless discussions about profits and expansion. From the moment he woke up to the moment he returned home late at night, his life revolved around making his businesses flourish. When he walked into the house, he would briefly acknowledge his children, Jennifer and Paul, with a pat on the head or a distracted, "Good job today," but it was always a passing gesture. The moment his shoes hit the marble floors, he would retreat into his office, working tirelessly into the night. Mrs. Adiola, his wife, ran her own boutique. She was known for her impeccable taste and the ability to turn a small shop into a flourishing business. But she, too, was just as busy as her husband. Every morning, she left before sunrise, heading to her boutique, and returned only after the sun had set, always bringing with her new stock, new trends, and new ideas for marketing campaigns. When she came home, her mind was already focused on the next day's strategy, not on the children who were waiting for her. Jennifer and Paul, though well-fed and clothed in the finest brands, felt a deep ache in their hearts. They longed for something their parents could not give them: time. One evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Mrs. Adiola hurriedly placed plates on the table, giving each of them their favorite dishes. Jennifer had rice and beans, Paul had his favorite chicken wings, and Mr. Adiola had the steak he always requested. The meal, like many others, was silent. The television played softly in the background, but no one was paying attention to it. Jennifer kept glancing at her parents, her fingers tracing the rim of her water glass, while Paul quietly chewed his food, his mind lost in thought. "How was your day at school, Paul?" Mrs. Adiola asked, without really looking at him, as she checked her phone for a new business email. "Fine," Paul muttered. "And Jennifer?" she asked, still not looking up. "It was okay," Jennifer replied, her voice barely audible. The conversation lasted only a few moments before it faded into more silence. The clinking of silverware and the soft hum of the television were the only sounds that filled the room. When the meal was finished, Jennifer and Paul quickly retreated to their rooms, as they often did. They didn't want to disturb their parents, who were already back to work. Mr. Adiola was in his office, reviewing financial reports, while Mrs. Adiola was in her study, planning the next big sales campaign for her boutique. There was no time for playful conversations, no time for family games, no time for the warmth of shared laughter. Jennifer sat at her desk, staring at the glow of her laptop screen. She had finished her homework earlier, but it didn't matter. She didn't feel like studying anymore. She wished she could talk to her mother, share her day, her thoughts, her feelings, but whenever she tried, her mother's response was always the same: "I'm busy, Jennifer. You're old enough to handle things on your own." Paul, on the other hand, sat by the window, gazing out at the street. He watched the children across the street laughing, playing soccer, and running around with their parents. His heart sank. He wished his father would play football with him, even once. He wished he could have a simple afternoon with his mother, talking about his schoolwork or just sharing a snack together. But there was no time for that. His father was always too busy, always on the phone, always in meetings. And his mother, though loving in her own way, was so caught up in her work that she couldn't give him the attention he craved. Every time they asked for their parents' time, it was always met with a quick excuse. "I'm working, Jennifer. I'm working, Paul," they would say. The idea of spending time with their children seemed far less important than running a successful business. It wasn't that Mr. and Mrs. Adiola didn't love their children, they did. But love, they thought, was expressed through material things: the best education, the finest clothes, and the ability to buy whatever they wanted. Jennifer and Paul didn't agree. They had everything money could buy, but they had no one to share it with. Their hearts ached for a different kind of love, the kind that could only be given through time and attention. But it seemed as though their parents were too busy to see that. The weeks turned into months, and the silence in the Adiola household grew. Jennifer began to feel invisible, and Paul began to retreat further into himself. They were two children living in a house filled with things, but empty of the love and attention they so desperately needed. And so, as their parents continued to build their empire, Jennifer and Paul built walls around their hearts, unknowingly drifting further away from the family they had once been so close to. The weeks slowly drifted into months, and Jennifer and Paul found themselves adjusting to the emptiness that their parents' absence left behind. The house, once bustling with the excitement of new toys and clothes, now felt like a shell, a place to sleep, eat, and get by. There were no playful moments, no late-night chats with their mother, no impromptu outings with their father. Just silence and the hum of daily routines. And in the silence, Jennifer and Paul began to grow distant not only from their parents but also from each other. For Jennifer, the longing for affection had become an ache so deep, she sometimes felt it physically. She would sit by the window in her room, staring at the world outside, watching children in the street laughing and playing with their parents. She could almost feel their joy radiating through the glass, but it only intensified her loneliness. How she wished that just once, her mother would sit beside her, run her fingers through her hair, and ask about her day. How she longed for her father to put down his phone and say, "Let's go to the park, Jennifer, just you and me." But those moments never came. Instead, Jennifer's attempts at connecting with her parents were met with cold detachment. Her mother, always busy with her boutique, barely had time for a quick hello before rushing out again, always speaking in rehearsed sentences: "I'll be back soon. Don't worry, I'll leave money for you." And Mr. Adiola, well, he never left his office. Every time Jennifer knocked on his door to ask if he had a moment, he would barely look up, his eyes glued to the computer screen. "Not now, Jennifer. I'm busy. We'll talk later, okay?" Later never came. Her friends at school, however, seemed to have everything she yearned for: loving parents who took an active interest in their lives, who attended parent-teacher meetings, who took them to their favorite places on weekends. Jennifer didn't care for the toys or the new clothes. She longed for something far more precious: time. Time that her parents had no time to give. At school, Jennifer found herself becoming quieter, withdrawing from the vibrant girl she once was. She kept to herself more, spending hours in the library with her books and homework, even though she no longer had any real interest in studying. She wasn't doing it for her parents. She wasn't doing it for herself, either. It was just a way to keep her occupied, to fill the time that her heart ached to have filled with the sounds of laughter, the warmth of her parents' voices, and the closeness of their love. But she couldn't keep her thoughts bottled up forever. One afternoon, after school, Jennifer approached her mother while she was going through emails in the living room. "Mom, can we talk?" she asked softly, her voice almost trembling with the weight of her unspoken words. Mrs. Adiola looked up, distracted, barely glancing at her daughter. "Not now, Jennifer. I'm busy. You can talk to me later, okay?" But Jennifer wasn't looking for a later. She needed to talk now. She needed to be seen, to be heard, to feel like she mattered. I just want to spend some time with you, Mom." Please, she pleaded. Mrs. Adiola sighed, her fingers pausing over the keyboard. I don't have time for this, Jennifer. You know I'm working hard to provide everything for you. Do you think money isn't enough? She glanced at her daughter for a moment, but then her gaze shifted back to her screen. Just take this money and go buy yourself something nice. Jennifer stood frozen, the words stinging more than they should have. But she said nothing. She didn't know how to explain that she didn't want money, she didn't want things, she wanted love, attention, time. But how could she expect her mother to understand when her life was so consumed with work? That evening, Jennifer found herself in her room, staring at the blank walls, feeling emptier than ever. She wanted to scream, to cry, but instead, she curled up on her bed, holding her knees to her chest. She felt so alone, so incredibly alone. Her parents' love, though present in the form of material goods, was absent in the way that truly mattered. She needed them, not just for what they could give her, but for their presence in her life. And it hurt more than words could express. For Paul, the feeling of neglect was no less sharp. But while Jennifer internalized her pain, Paul acted out. He began skipping school more frequently, spending his afternoons in the streets with friends who had no regard for rules. These friends, the ones who hung out at the corner shop, smoking and making trouble, didn't care about grades or success. They didn't need to sit down for family dinners or get permission before leaving the house. They lived for the moment, and Paul was quickly drawn into that world. At first, it was innocent enough. Just a few harmless pranks here and there, sneaking into the local park when he wasn't supposed to. But before long, he found himself hanging out with older boys, boys who had already dropped out of school, boys who smoked cigarettes and talked about getting into bigger trouble. Paul felt like he was finally part of something, something that made him feel seen, something that made him feel important. One evening, after a particularly reckless day at school, Paul came home late. His father's car was in the driveway, but there was no warmth in the house. Mr. Adiola was already in his office, as usual, going over reports. Paul could have easily gone to him, talked to him about his day, but he didn't bother. He didn't expect his father to listen. He didn't expect anything from him anymore. Where have you been, Mrs. Adiola asked curtly, not looking up from her phone. Do you know what time it is? Paul shrugged. Out. You need to stop hanging out with those boys. They'll get you into trouble, Paul, she said, her voice tinged with impatience. But Paul didn't care. I'm not a kid anymore, Mom. I'm fine, he said, his words sharp and defensive. He didn't want to hear the warnings, the concerns. He just wanted to be left alone, to keep living the way he was, away from the hurt, away from the emptiness. That night, as the house grew quiet and the lights dimmed, Jennifer sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the door. She longed to hear her mother's voice, to have her come in and say, "How was your day, Jennifer? What's going on in your life?" She longed for her father to come to her room, sit beside her, and simply ask, "Are you okay?" But none of that came. Instead, she tucked herself in, rolled over, and tried to fall asleep, her heart heavy with the longing for a love that seemed too far away to reach. As the months rolled by, the cracks in Jennifer and Paul's worlds deepened. What began as an unspoken longing for affection soon transformed into a desperate search for validation, one they couldn't find within their own home. Their growing emotional isolation was being met with dangerous consequences, and neither of them seemed to realize just how far they were drifting into trouble. For Jennifer, the loneliness she felt started to turn into something else, resentment. The pain of being ignored by her parents festered, and she began to seek attention from the one place that seemed to fill the empty space inside her, her new group of friends. It all started innocently enough. Jennifer had always been a social girl, eager to make friends and connect with others. But this time, the friends she found were different. They didn't talk about school or grades. They didn't care about being responsible or being good students. They lived in the moment, disregarding the future and any consequences that might follow. At first, Jennifer was drawn to their carefree attitude. They didn't expect anything from her except to be one of them. These were the kind of friends who skipped classes, who wandered around the mall without any real plans, who smoked behind the school gym when the teachers weren't looking. They were exciting, wild, and rebellious, everything Jennifer felt she had been missing. Her new friends saw her as someone who didn't have to be the perfect student or the quiet, shy girl in the corner. They encouraged her to step outside of the box her parents had tried to put her in. At first, Jennifer didn't care. What was school, really? It didn't matter to her if she skipped a few classes, nothing she did was ever good enough for her parents anyway. She didn't care about the grades. The compliments from her friends, the attention she received when she was with them, meant more than any school achievement ever could. But the more time she spent with this group, the more reckless and distant she became. The thrill of their adventures became an addiction. One evening, after a long night of skipping school and hanging out in the park, Jennifer came home late, her heart pounding with excitement. She had done things she never thought she would, smoking, sneaking into a concert without a ticket, and feeling like she was part of something that made her feel alive. When she walked through the front door, the house was quiet. Mr. Adiola was still in his office, working, and Mrs. Adiola was out at one of her meetings. Jennifer didn't even stop to see them. She just went straight to her room, too tired and wired to care about anything else. Her phone buzzed, and she saw messages from her friends asking her to meet up again the next day. She smiled, knowing she would say yes. She had found her place, her people. For Paul, the drift into dangerous territory was more immediate. While Jennifer buried herself in rebellion and reckless friendships, Paul turned to something darker. After weeks of ignoring his parents' warnings, he found himself more and more involved with a group of older boys, boys who had no interest in school, no interest in anything but living fast and breaking the rules. They were called the Curtis, a local gang that had a reputation for causing trouble around the neighborhood. The Curtis gang was infamous, known for petty thefts, fights, and other troublemaking. They were the outcasts, the ones who rejected authority and reveled in the chaos they caused. To Paul, they were a symbol of freedom, freedom from the endless expectations that had been placed on him. His parents wanted him to be a perfect student, to follow their rules, to never make mistakes. But these boys didn't care about any of that. They accepted Paul without question. They made him feel like he mattered, something his parents had never done. It was on a rainy afternoon in late October when Paul got his first real taste of what it meant to be in the gang. The Curtis boys had decided to steal a car, just for the thrill of it. "You in or out, Paul?" one of the older boys asked, his voice thick with excitement. Paul hesitated, his mind racing. He knew it was wrong, knew his parents would disown him if they found out. But then he thought about the emptiness in his life, the way his father had been too busy to care, the way his mother's only response to his pleas had been, "You're old enough to understand." Without another thought, Paul jumped in the car, feeling the rush of adrenaline course through his veins as they sped off into the night. That feeling, of finally being part of something, was more than he could resist. The thrill of breaking the rules became addictive. Paul began skipping school more often, sneaking out late at night to meet up with his new friends, and getting involved in more criminal activities. It didn't take long for his behavior to spiral. He stopped caring about the consequences. In his eyes, the world owed him something, and he wasn't going to wait for his parents to give it to him. One night, after a particularly reckless stunt, Paul was caught by the police. They had been caught in a car chase after a robbery gone wrong, and Paul was arrested along with the others. His heart pounded as the officers cuffed him, the reality of what he had become finally sinking in. The first thing he thought about as he sat in the cold cell was his parents. What would they say? What would they do? But deep down, he knew the answer. They wouldn't care. They'd probably just pay the bail and send him back to school. They never had time for him before, and he didn't believe they would make the time now. As the months passed, Jennifer and Paul's worlds became more tangled in the webs of bad influence and rebellion. Jennifer, lost in her friendship with the reckless crowd, began to feel more isolated from her family. She saw her parents less and less, finding solace in the chaos of her new life. Every time she tried to reach out to them, they were too busy. So, she kept going, deeper into the life that was filling the hole in her heart, even though she knew it wasn't the answer. For Paul, the escape from his troubled home led him deeper into the darkness. His time in the gang only pushed him further away from the possibility of ever having a normal life. He was becoming more like the people he associated with, angry, lost, and detached. He stopped answering his parents' calls, stopped showing up at family events, and began to believe that maybe this was all he deserved. By the time Jennifer entered university, the walls around her heart had become thicker. She had found herself immersed in a world of friends who, though they gave her attention, led her down a path that grew more and more dangerous with each passing day. The rebellion, the late nights, the thrill-seeking, it all felt like a way to escape the emptiness that had consumed her for so long. But deep down, Jennifer knew that the excitement was fleeting, and she longed for something more. Her relationship with her parents had reached its breaking point. Every attempt she made to get closer to them had been met with the same cold indifference. They had grown more distant with time, absorbed in their business ventures, their lives running on autopilot while hers spiraled further out of control. Jennifer often found herself wishing that they would notice, that they would see how broken she was. But their answer was always the same: "We're working to give you everything, Jennifer. That's all that matters." But it wasn't enough. She didn't need things, she needed them. She needed her parents to show up for her, to be there when she needed someone to talk to ask her how she was doing, to notice the sadness in her eyes. Yet, they never did. It wasn't long before Jennifer met Marcus, a charming, smooth-talking boy who seemed to offer the attention and affection she had been yearning for. Marcus had a way with words, always making her feel like she was the center of his universe. He told her all the things she wanted to hear: how beautiful she was, how he couldn't imagine his life without her. He made her feel seen, something her parents hadn't done in years. At first, it was innocent enough: a few dates, some stolen kisses, and whispered promises of a future together. Jennifer's heart swelled with the excitement of being loved and wanted. But as time went on, Marcus began to change. His affection shifted from sweetness to possessiveness, and Jennifer found herself pulled into a whirlwind of emotions she couldn't understand. He was controlling, yet she couldn't bring herself to walk away. He was the one person who made her feel like she mattered. Their relationship grew more intense, and soon, Jennifer was inseparable from Marcus. But with that intensity came the darker side of their connection. Marcus introduced her to a lifestyle she never imagined: parties, alcohol, and drugs. Jennifer knew it was dangerous, but every time she tried to pull away, Marcus would tell her she was overthinking things. "It's just fun, Jen. Everyone does it," he would say, convincing her that it was normal. The thrill of being with him, of finally feeling alive, made her forget the hollow ache in her chest. One night, after a particularly wild party, Jennifer found herself in an unexpected situation. She was pregnant. The news hit her like a cold, unfeeling wave. Her heart raced, and for a moment, everything felt still, like the world had stopped spinning, and she was trapped in the silence of her own panic. She couldn't believe it. This wasn't part of the plan. She wasn't ready for a baby. She wasn't ready for the consequences of what had happened. And yet, she didn't want to tell her parents. What would they think? What would they say? She couldn't imagine the disappointment in their eyes, the judgment, the coldness. They had already been absent from her life for so long, she didn't want them to turn their backs on her completely. So, she kept it a secret. Marcus, on the other hand, was insistent. He promised her that they could fix it, that everything would be fine. We don't need a baby now, Jennifer, he told her. I'll take care of it. You don't have to worry about anything. Jennifer didn't know what to do. She was terrified, lost, and completely alone. Marcus reassured her, telling her that they would handle it, that they would take care of everything. He told her he knew a way to fix the situation, to make everything go away. And that's when the tragedy unfolded. Jennifer, in her desperation, agreed to what Marcus suggested, an illegal, unsafe abortion. She didn't have the strength to tell him no, to walk away from the situation. She was too scared, too vulnerable. And so, she found herself in a dingy, unsanitary clinic with Marcus by her side, but not offering any comfort. His face showed no emotion, just the cold detachment of someone who didn't care about the aftermath, only about the immediate solution to their problem. The procedure was quick, but Jennifer knew something was wrong almost immediately. Her body hurt in ways she couldn't describe, and the blood wouldn't stop. She tried to tell Marcus, tried to ask him to take her to a hospital, but he just looked at her, distant and cold. It'll pass, he said, dismissing her pain. But it didn't pass. In the days that followed, Jennifer grew weaker. Her body fought against the procedure, but she couldn't bring herself to tell anyone. Marcus had already disappeared, his promises empty, his affection nothing more than a lie. She was alone. When she finally collapsed in her apartment, barely able to move, it was too late. By the time she was rushed to the hospital, it was clear that Jennifer had lost her life. The doctors were unable to save her. The world she had longed to escape had swallowed her whole, and she was gone, leaving behind nothing but broken dreams, shattered promises, and an empty space where love should have been. The consequences of absence. When Mr. and Mrs. Adiola finally learned of their daughter's death, the shock hit them like a physical blow. They had been too late. They had failed her. They had been so consumed with their businesses, so absorbed in the chase for wealth, that they had missed the most important thing, their daughter's plea for love and attention. Jennifer's funeral was a blur of faces, family, friends, and strangers, standing in mourning, but her parents couldn't bring themselves to even look at the crowd. They were lost in their guilt, their grief overwhelming, the realization that their absence had led to their daughter's tragic end sinking in with crushing weight. They had provided for her. They had given her everything they thought she needed. But they had failed to give her the one thing that mattered most: love, time, and attention. They had left her to seek affection from the wrong places, from people who didn't care about her well-being. And now, they had lost her forever. While Jennifer's tragic end left an indelible scar on the Adiola family, Paul's path toward destruction was just beginning. The news of Jennifer's death shook the household to its core. Mr. and Mrs. Adiola were consumed by grief and guilt, yet still, their focus never strayed far from their businesses. In the days following Jennifer's funeral, their sorrow became an extension of their routine, quiet, internalized, and ultimately self-absorbed. But for Paul, the loss of his sister didn't just intensify his anger and frustration, it deepened the darkness he had been slowly sinking into for years. As the family mourned in silence, Paul grew more distant, more hardened, and more rebellious. Paul's mind, already fragile from years of neglect, now spiraled into a place of confusion and resentment. He had already been caught in the downward spiral of bad influences, but the grief of losing Jennifer seemed to push him deeper into the pit. The questions that had been plaguing him for years, why didn't they notice? Why didn't they care? Suddenly consumed him. The anger that had once been a quiet ember now flared into a blaze, and he found solace in it. Who cares? He thought bitterly. Who even cares anymore? At school, Paul became more disruptive. His teachers noticed his decline in grades, his refusal to participate, and his general disregard for authority. But Paul didn't care. He had no respect for the institution of education, just as he had lost all respect for the idea of family. His only escape now was the Curtis gang, the group of older boys who had welcomed him into their fold long ago. They were the only ones who seemed to understand him, or so Paul thought. The gang was full of misfits and outcasts, people who had been discarded by society and had, in turn, discarded society. The Curtis gang didn't care about the rules, about right and wrong, about what was expected. They lived in the moment, in a chaotic and carefree existence that Paul was desperate to be part of. One evening, after skipping school again, Paul met up with the Curtis gang. They were hanging out in their usual spot, an old, abandoned warehouse near the outskirts of town. It was their sanctuary, a place where they could be themselves, away from prying eyes. Paul arrived to find the group gathered around, laughing and joking, passing around a bottle of cheap vodka. The air was thick with smoke and the sound of raucous laughter. "Hey, Paul," one of the older boys, Sam, called out, his voice slurred. "You here to join the fun or what?" Paul nodded, his expression unreadable. His world was crumbling, but in that moment, the chaos around him felt like the only thing that made sense. No one asked questions. No one expected anything from him. He could just exist, without anyone telling him he wasn't enough, without anyone expecting him to be the son they wanted. As the weeks passed, Paul's life became more entangled with the gang's activities. What had started as harmless fun, drinking, sneaking into clubs, and stealing small items, soon escalated into more serious crimes. Robberies, street fights, and petty drug dealing became part of Paul's daily life. He was no longer the boy his parents had known. His identity had been replaced by the gang's identity, and it was all-consuming. One night, the gang decided to target a local convenience store. The plan was simple: walk in, intimidate the clerk, take the cash, and leave. But when the robbery went awry, Paul's life changed forever. The store clerk, a young woman, had recognized one of the gang members. She screamed when she saw him. Chaos erupted. Paul, who had been standing near the door, froze. The others tried to flee, but in the midst of the confusion, Paul was grabbed by a police officer who had just entered the store. The handcuffs clicked shut around Paul's wrists, and for the first time in years, he felt a rush of fear that wasn't fueled by anger. He had been caught. There was no escape now. The officer looked at him with a mix of disappointment and pity. "Thought you'd never end up here, huh?" the officer muttered, shaking his head. Paul was sent to juvenile detention while the rest of the gang scattered, their lives continuing in a loop of criminal behavior. His parents, as expected, were too late. They had been notified of his arrest, but by the time they visited him in the detention center, Paul had already changed. He was no longer the boy who had once hoped for their attention, their love, their approval. He had stopped hoping altogether. In the visitation room, Paul sat across from his mother and father. His mother's face was pale, her hands trembling as she tried to compose herself. His father, once a towering figure in his life, now looked small and helpless. "Paul," Mrs. Adiola whispered, tears filling her eyes. "Why didn't you come to us? Why didn't you talk to us? We would have helped you. We could have helped you." But Paul couldn't answer. He couldn't bring himself to speak. All he could do was sit there in silence, the walls of his heart built higher than ever. His parents didn't understand. They had never understood. They still didn't get it. They never would. For the first time, Paul realized the full weight of his life's choices. He had been lost long before his arrest, long before Jennifer's death, long before his parents' neglect had consumed him. He had tried to fill the emptiness with anger, with rebellion, and with meaningless relationships. But now, he was trapped in a system that didn't care about him, and he had no one left to blame but himself. The days in juvenile detention passed slowly. Paul spent most of his time alone in his cell, reflecting on everything he had lost, the time he could never get back, the love he had once hoped for, and the future that now seemed unreachable. He thought about Jennifer, about how she had tried to reach out, how she had needed their attention just as much as he had. He thought about his parents and how they had failed to see his pain until it was too late. When he was eventually released, Paul was a changed person, but not for the better. The anger and resentment that had once been his driving force were still with him, but now they were tinged with something darker, a deep sense of hopelessness that clouded his every thought. A life lost. The years following his release from detention weren't any better. Paul drifted from one low-paying job to another, unable to maintain any stability. He couldn't shake the darkness that had taken hold of him, and every time he tried to start anew, the weight of his past dragged him back. Mr. and Mrs. Adiola, though devastated by the loss of their daughter, continued to bury themselves in work. Their relationship with Paul remained strained. They had tried, in their way, to help him, but it was clear that their love had never been enough to fill the gap left by years of emotional neglect. Paul's life, marked by mistakes and missed opportunities, had become a reflection of the very thing that had caused his downfall: the absence of love, attention, and time. In the end, it wasn't the world that had failed him, it was his parents. And by the time they realized it, it was too late.